They've got curved swords. Curved swords. So yeah, on this channel we see quite a lot of different types of swords, don't we? We see straight swords, curved swords, wide swords, narrow swords, all the sorts of swords. Obviously I focus on other weapons as well occasionally, spears and axes and all of those kind of things, but swords do get a lot of focus. I've spoken a lot why do swords get so much focus in the past. I'm not going to be looking at in this video. What I'm going to be looking at is why are so many swords curved, and is it good? Is it a good thing if a sword is curved? Well, first thing we've got to say is that curved swords, we could say, have been around for all of history. If we go back to things like the khopesh, for example, the Egyptian khopesh, which is curved in a sense. It's not curved like this, but it's curved that gives you a similar sort of chopping effect to an axe. If we look at the weapons of India, for example, in Europe we'd know as the Middle Ages, so let's say the sort of 13th, 14th, 15th centuries in India, we actually see that a lot of Indian swords, despite the fact that Indian swords are famous perhaps for being curved, as a lot of Middle Eastern swords are, in India and Persia and North Africa and the Middle East, a lot of swords actually, until about the 14th, 15th century, were straight, okay? And then in the 14th, 15th century, you start to get more and more curved blades like this. And if we look at Indian swords, for example, the ubiquitous kind of talwar, let's grab one off the floor, actually really starts to become common in India in the 16th century, and thereafter becomes the dominant type of sword. So, why was it that these curved swords spread around the world, even to Europe, of course, because the beloved cavalry sabre was very often curved, technically, if it's a sabre, it is curved, although in some languages I accept that sometimes, for example, in France, for example, if you say sabre, then it doesn't necessarily mean curved. You can have a straight sabre, which makes no sense to me, but there we go, different languages are different. But why did they spread all over the world? Well, that's a very complicated question, and I think one for another video. It's a very big topic, but just to briefly touch on it, I think you've got many factors involved there. Including the spread of certain cultures, perhaps even the spread of certain religions, types of mounted combat, so types of light cavalry. For example, if we look in Eastern Europe in the period of Charlemagne, shall we say, the Avars, for example, were using curved sabres by the sort of by the 8th, 9th century. And yet, if we look at areas which are later famous for using sabres, so we look at the lands in North Africa, the Moors, essentially, they were using straight swords at that time. If we look a little bit later at areas that were invaded by the Mongols, very often where the Mongols went, their slightly curved swords, it has to be said, not dissimilar actually to Avar swords, influenced swords where they went. And similarly in India, the reason we start to see curved swords coming in there is because of the Islamic invasions of the 16th century. So the Mughals, basically, Moguls. So essentially, we often see that curved swords are brought with people to an area that they conquer. But why did they choose curved swords, and are curved swords better in any way? Well, first of all, better in what context, okay? So I am Captain Context. I'm here to bring the context and stick it right into every video. And quite simply, different weapons will work better in different situations. So a Dane axe, for example, is not going to work very well on horseback, is it, as a mounted weapon? Yes, you could technically try and swing a Dane axe on horseback, but it'd be a bit ridiculous. It's certainly not an optimum weapon for that scenario. Some weapons are better in one context and some in another. That's just mounted versus foot, but equally some weapons obviously are better against armour, some are better against unarmoured people, some are better in a civilian environment where you're not necessarily wearing any armour or nothing on your hands, so on and so forth. You know all of that. Regular viewers of this channel know all that stuff by now. So is a curved sword better? Well, it depends what the context is. Let's talk about the most obvious context, light cavalry. Okay, so it has to be said right at the outset that curved swords seem to be associated with groups of people who like to fight on horseback, who have lots of access to horses or ponies, who ride around and do a lot of hit and run type stuff, although not necessarily only that, but are famous for that. like the Mongols, like the Avars. So is this kind of curved blade design better for light cavalry? Well, evidence would suggest yes, based on the fact that they were widely used by everybody who had this type of light cavalry, whether it was the Poles or any of the light cavalry used during the sort of Napoleonic era in 19th century in Europe, or indeed if we go back into earlier periods, as I said, like the Mongols or the Avars or so on and so forth. And the fact is that there are certain physical characteristics to the curved blade which mean that it is conducive to use on horseback. The key example being that it is curved. Now, I've spoken a lot about in the past about when you're on horseback and you strike something with a weapon, you're travelling at speed, and usually the thing that you're hitting, unless you're riding along next to each other, duking it out, the thing that you're hitting is going to go past you quite quickly. It doesn't matter whether it's someone on foot who might be stationary or not looking at you, good target by the way, or if it's someone who's riding at you with their sword swinging at you as well. And the curved blade enables you to hit the target and naturally draw off it without sort of hitting and stopping, which is very important in terms of keeping the weapon in your hand. But additionally, it can in some situations increase the damage done because of the natural curve of the blade. Now, we know from later sources that curved blades were sometimes used almost like a thrust, like giving point with a straighter sword, but because of the curve of the blade, what you actually hit the target with is the edge. And hitting with the edge enables you to slide the blade across and through the target and without entering or getting stuck into it. So if you imagine you're riding at me and I'm riding at you, potentially I could lay my blade across this way. Rather than thinking about it that way, there are things you could do with the blade that way, but if we lay it across this way, I can now lay my edge into your face or neck or head as we go past, and as you go past, it slides across, slicing, and my horse moves and it stays free. It doesn't get stuck in the target, it doesn't stop on the target. And additionally, having done this, because my weapon's still free, it gives me the option of being able to pass around and cut again that way, or indeed to pass around and cut to someone else who might be a problem somewhere else to me. So the curved blade is good at passing across things quickly and not getting stuck in them, not stopping on them and staying free. That's good. We've also talked a bit about in the past about the advantage of curved blades thrusting around things. Now, generally speaking, for cavalry who are moving and not getting engaged at a fixed distance and duking it out, this isn't necessarily an advantageous factor. However, there is one situation where the curve of the blade can assist the thrust, and that is when attacking people on foot. So very often, when we're talking about cavalry, you have to remember that cavalry is often designed to attack infantry when they are disorganized, running away, or engaged in their front line against other infantry. So very often cavalry's job is to attack people on foot when they're not really expecting it, okay? Not just slamming them into the front, but attacking them in the flanks or the rear, or when they're running away or whatever, okay? And in that situation, if you're attacking someone who's significantly below you because you're sitting on a horse, and obviously the bigger the horse, the truer this becomes, a straight line thrust isn't necessarily always the best thing to do, okay? Because we end up with strange sort of angles and having to then extract your point. And we have talked about this in previous videos in reference to the 1908 pattern and this drill whereby you give point, and as you pass through, as your horse keeps on going, you let the arm swing through. It's exactly the same motion as they use still in tent pegging. Okay, so if you look for tent pegging videos on YouTube, there's lots of really cool ones, and it's the same thing. You plant the point in and then you have to let it swing through. But if you have a curved blade, what you can actually do, and I won't be able to show you this exactly because if I was sitting on a horse, the infantry would be below the level of the camera, but if you imagine my sword is coming in like this, if I'm riding my horse and I'm holding the sword down there to stick someone through the chest with the point of the sword is essentially in that angle, and at that angle the point can enter the target and then come out and through that way quite easily. Well, I won't say easily, but it's conducive to it. And because the curved blade is not straight, the force of the blow, it will enter the target to some degree, and then the blade will naturally divert. And funnily enough, usually this is listed as a reason why straighter blades are better at penetrating. And yep, that's absolutely true, but equally, straighter blades have a problem with over-penetrating. They're so good at penetrating, they can go so deep into a target, it can be very difficult to extract the point. An irony is that by being less good at penetrating deeply, the curved blade actually can aid extraction. So it may be harder getting it in, but getting it out, it's going to be a little bit easier. So curved blades have a lot going for them in a cavalry context. But what about curved blades on foot? Do they have any advantages on foot? Well, it would be tempting to just say no, wouldn't it? Okay, because if we take a straight blade, so I take my broadsword bladed British infantry officer's sword here, there are certain advantages to a curved blade to a straight blade that a curved blade doesn't necessarily have. The most obvious one is your point is in line with your hand. Okay, and that gives you better. It's not to say that the curved blade can't thrust, but it gives you, in general, in most scenarios, in most fencing situations, certainly one-on-one, having a straight blade is advantageous to getting the point into the opponent. And we all know that stabbing someone with the point of a sword is a very effective way of putting them out of action or killing them. Okay, cuts, generally speaking, are less lethal than points are. And if the point is in line with the hand, it makes it easier to penetrate through clothes, potentially even armour. And it also gives you a better bind. It means you can cover a line and still have the point on line quite easily. Okay. Also, in terms of cutting, I would assert that in most situations it's actually easier to lay on the edge onto the opponent from further away with a straight blade than with a curved blade. Now, why should that be? Well, quite simply, if the handles are in line with each other, okay, so if I line up these handles, you will see that in their arcs of rotation, the cutting portion of the blade is up sort of 8 inches down from the tip, okay? And you will see that the straight blade will arrive at the target before the curved blade. It's as simple as that. That if your blade is curved back towards you, it's further away from the opponent. Okay, now you could say, okay, but that's fine, but you just deliver the cut in a way that means you project the cutting portion forwards and it's irrelevant to the angle of the hilt, and that's true to some degree. But the general tendency is if you've got, say, 34 inches of steel and you bend it, you don't have 34 inches of reach anymore, you now only have about 30 inches of reach. So for a given amount of blade, you have less reach with a curved blade than you do with a straight blade. And when you add to that you can't really thrust so effectively with it anymore. Yes, you can thrust, you can give curved thrusts, but they don't have as much reach and they're more awkward than a straight thrust. Essentially, a curved blade has less reach than a straight sword. Now, there is one situation where that's not necessarily a problem, and that's where a large shield is involved. Okay, so if I've got a shield, then I'm able to close in distance and cover distance in such a way that I can come into distance to get my curved blade into action. Okay, and that's absolutely fine, but we're just considering sword versus sword here. And you could still say that if both people have shields, the person with the straight sword will still be able to outrange the person with the curved sword. Case in point being leg targets, okay? And I was experimenting with this recently, actually using a curved blade in sparring, and my opponent was very often able to snipe at my legs at a distance whereby I couldn't reach them because of my curved blade, okay? There are some other advantages to curved blades on foot, which I've spoken about again before. I touched on one just a minute ago, and that is these curved thrusts. These curved thrusts can be quite tricksy things to come around people's guards. So you could lay a cut in, and when they put the guard, you can then flip the point around and stab them over their guard, over their parry, essentially. Equally, these curved blades can come around the edges of shields, under or over, incidentally. And additionally, there are some cuts. So if you have a raised yeoman, like on a Turkish kilich, for example, this example is completely blunt on the back. It's just a single edge, like a shamshir blade. if you have an edged back false edge, Yeoman, then there are certain things you can do with the back edge as well, cutting around behind someone's sword guard to nick them in the wrist, coming down to the leg, all this kind of stuff. Okay, so there are things you can do, definitely. But generally speaking, I would say that on foot, I would assert, and feel free to argue with this, the straight blade has an advantage over a curved blade. There is another factor as well, and that's cutting. So people talk a lot about cutting efficiency, and people go, oh, but Matt, doesn't the curved blade cut better? Yes and no. It depends what you're cutting, okay? If you're aiming to cut through layers of fabric, you have to slice through those, okay? Simple impact won't do very much against layers of fabric. It's possible that that's another reason why curved swords were popular in certain parts of Asia and North Africa and the Middle East. Because there were certain types of clothes, materials worn, silk for example. It's possible that that's another factor. In terms of slicing, essentially sawing through something, yes, a curved blade will do that more. There's another thing that another advantage the curved blade has, and that is it assists edge alignment. As soon as you start to swing the blade, the inertia of having something that trails behind, a bit like the tail on an aeroplane or just anything with something sticking out of the back, a ball with a stick sticking out, as soon as you start to throw the ball, the stick will point backwards, won't it? It's the same thing with a sword. The blade will naturally want to trail back, and so therefore that aids edge alignment. Okay, and in fact Henry Wilkinson specifically says this. He specifically says that the curve on most European swords is so slight that it doesn't add anything to the slicing effect, but what it does add to is edge alignment. Okay, and so that was his reason of including a slight curve on British military swords, was for edge alignment. But if we come back to the curved sword, so essentially, yeah, there are some other advantages to curves, but I would say overall there is generally an advantage for the straight sword. As I say, there's always strengths and weaknesses to both, but I would say that in foot combat, a straight sword's advantages outweigh the curved sword's advantages. In most scenarios, although as I say, there might be situations, shields, types of clothing, things like that, which change this kind of debate. So we come to the point where we say, okay, so curved swords make a lot of sense. On horseback. They make some sense on foot, but maybe not as much as a straight sword. So to finish off, I want to consider, is there really any difference between having a super curved sword, and is it a situation of the more curved the better? If you want a curved sword, just make it as curved as possible. This is pretty damn curved. This is as curved as most Arabian Shamshir would be. Okay, so it's quite like swords you might find in Saudi Arabia or places like this, or Syria, that kind of thing. Is there an advantage to having a blade that's that curved, or is that curve enough? So these two swords I've picked for a very specific reason. They are both swords which were used during the period of the British Empire in the late 19th century, or probably even up to around 1900, and you'll see that they both have Western style hilts, although they were intended for Indian officers, probably not for British officers, but Indian officers serving in the Indian Army, which was connected to obviously the British Army. And they both have sabre blades, or both have curved blades, but the one below is very much more curved than the one above. The one above, in fact, is a British-made regulation light cavalry sword for Indian cavalry, okay, mounted on an infantry officer's hilt. Very nice sword. And this is a completely custom-made, locally made Indian piece with a curved blade that I thought at one point might be Woot's, but I've tried test etching it and it's unfortunately not, or at least as far as I can tell it's not, although I think it is pattern welded. So they're similar in some ways, but is there any advantage to the more curved one? Well, I think it comes back to what we've just been talking about. The more curved blade means that you could potentially it may be more beneficial on horseback in certain applications. It may be better at getting around shields, might be better at getting around a person's guard and using for those sort of techniques. But look, if you look at the reach of the two weapons, although they're the same length, generally speaking, because the curved blade is always lagging behind your rotation, your sort of leverage, I would say that this sword has better reach in general, and if you do want to use the point, I would say that this has a better alignment for using the point. And in terms of edge alignment, they're both pretty much equal because they both drag behind, they are both curved, so that assists both. In terms of slicing, yes, the more curved blade will slice more, but you could say the slightly straighter blade will hack more, okay, because it's more in line with the rotational movement of your hand. So, by and large, are curved swords advantageous? I'd say it all depends on how you're going to use them. But to answer one question I raised just a couple of minutes ago, is there a limit to the curve? Yes, quite simply. Okay, so you have to think about hitting something. When you move a sword, you can move it in a straight line, okay, or you can move it in a circular arc, okay. And those things achieve different objectives. But if you make the blade so curved that essentially you're never going to reach the target very easily. Now, this is one of the things when we talk about the disc pommel on tulwars, and we talk about not letting it open out from the wrist and hit here. When we strike here, the problem is, and one of the disadvantages of this style of cutting, is that you don't reach very much further than reach of your own arm, okay? And that means you're always at a reach disadvantage. Not saying that that's always a disadvantage per se, because you might be using a shield, you might be closing in so quickly that's the distance you want to fight at, that's fine. But generally speaking, if you're duking it out with one person who's also got a sword and they're extending the weapon out and you're not, they're going to be able to hit you from a distance where you can't hit them, okay, which forces you into guarding as you close to then do your draw cut, essentially. Now, if you've got a very curved blade, what it forces you to do is to essentially be always drawing your weapon, because even if you extend out here, the blade's going to be curving back so much that it's going to be very hard to hit the target with any sort of leverage or any sort of force. Right, okay, I'm going to finish up there. But so there aren't any hard and fast conclusions on this topic. Are there some advantages to having curved blades? Yes, definitely. I would say primarily edge alignment, and also a degree of increased slicing capacity. But remember, when you increase slicing capacity, you reduce impact or hack capacity, okay? Definitely there are some contexts, primarily being mounted or on foot, where curved swords are more appropriate and more advantageous than straight swords. But I think that on foot, generally speaking, the straight sword has most of the advantages. And generally speaking, on horseback, for light cavalry who are just going to hit and run and keep moving, keep riding at high speed, a curved sword. But cavalry who get into close combat and get into a melee, that starts to become more like foot combat, and that's when we start to see straight swords more popular again. And I don't think it's any coincidence that when we look at the 19th century cavalry swords, it's very often the case that light cavalry, in other words, the fast-moving, keep-riding guys, they have curved swords, and the heavy cavalry very often have straight swords. Although later in the 19th century, the two roles became more similar, and they all had the same swords. But anyway, so there we go, curved swords. Are they a massive advantage? No, not really. They're just a specific tool for a specific job. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.